at Elva, 50 a.m. On the 30th of August 1943, Marine Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh crouched inside the cramped, gasoline-scented cockpit of a borrowed F-4U Corsair, watching the oil pressure needle dance dangerously close to the red line with a rhythmic, mocking twitch that seemed to count down the remaining seconds of his life. He was 4,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, a jagged archipelago of emerald green and volcanic ash, completely alone in a sky that felt far too vast for a single man in a broken machine. His engine was not merely running, it was screaming, a guttural, metallic howl of protest, as the cylinders struggled against the friction of failing lubrication. Below him, the Pacific Ocean was a flat sheet of blue steel, beautiful and indifferent, waiting with infinite patience to swallow any pilot foolish enough to trust a machine that had already failed him once that morning. But Walsh was not looking at the water, nor was he checking his compass for a heading back to the safety of the base at Vella La Vella. His eyes were locked on a terrifying, shifting shape forming in the clouds 3 miles ahead, a dark stain against the horizon that looked like a swarm of angry gnats, a chaotic black cloud shifting and swirling in the blinding tropical sun. But they were not insects, they were Mitsubishi A6M0s, 50 of them, a wall of Japanese steel and experienced pilots hungry for American blood. Walsh tightened his grip on the control stick until his leather glove creaked, the sound lost in the deafening roar of the 2,000 horsepower engine. The vibration of the massive double wasp engine rattled his teeth and blurred his vision, shaking the entire airframe with the violence of a jackhammer. He checked his rearview mirror, hoping for the sight of a friendly wingman, but it was empty, reflecting only the vast, empty blue of the Solomon sky. The rest of his squadron was gone, forced to turn back by mechanical failures and the treacherous, unpredictable weather of the South Pacific, leaving Walsh as the only thing standing between 50 Japanese fighters and a flight of defenseless American bombers. A sane pilot, a man trained in the cold logic of survival, would have turned around. The rulebook, written in the blood of those who came before him, said that engaging 50 enemy aircraft alone was not bravery, it was a complicated form of suicide, a waste of a valuable pilot and a precious airframe. The flight surgeons would have called it combat fatigue, a mind broken by the endless stress of the jungle war. The commanding officers back at headquarters would have called it reckless, a court-martial offense. But Kenneth Walsh did not care what the officers thought, for he had spent his entire life being told what he could and could not do by men who had never seen the inside of a combustion chamber. He pushed the throttle forward, feeling the raw, unbridled power of 2,000 horses kick him in the small of his back, and pointed the long, oil-streaked nose of his Corsair directly into the heart of the swarm. To truly understand why a man would fly a broken plane into a massacre, you have to understand that the United States Navy never wanted Kenneth Walsh in that cockpit in the first place. In the rigid, class-conscious hierarchy of 1,943, fighter pilots were supposed to be gentlemen, the elite knights of the sky. They were recruited from the hallowed halls of Ivy League universities, young men with degrees in engineering or classical literature, officers who knew which fork to use at a high society dinner party and how to salute with a perfect, practiced crispness. Kenneth Walsh was none of these things. He was a high school graduate from the rough streets of Brooklyn, a man who spoke with the grit of the city and the directness of a mechanic. He was a former private, a man who had climbed the ranks through sheer competence rather than social standing. He was a mechanic who had spent years wiping grease off his hands and fixing the expensive mistakes of the college boys who broke the very planes he pretentious repaired. The other officers called pilots like him Mustangs, a derogatory term that was meant to remind him that he was a wild animal that had been let into the house, tolerated but never truly welcomed. In the officers' mess hall, the divide was invisible but as hard as concrete. The college boys flew with a slide rule and a textbook, calculating fuel mixtures and turn radiuses like they were solving a sterile math equation on a chalkboard. Walsh flew with a wrench in his mind and the spirit of a street fighter. He flew by the seat of his pants, feeling the vibration of the cylinders through the thick rubber soles of his boots and interpreting the language of the machine. When the college boys complained that an engine sounded rough, Walsh knew exactly which valve was sticking, just by listening to the subtle change in the exhaust note. They mocked him for it, laughing at his lack of polish and his aggressive, unrefined flying style that favored brute force over elegance. They said a grease monkey had no business handling a machine worth $100,000, a machine that was the pinnacle of American engineering. And the machine they were flying was not just any airplane. It was the WWII Corsair, and in late 1943, it was widely considered the most dangerous and temperamental aircraft in the American arsenal. The Navy had already rejected it for carrier duty because it killed too many pilots during the landing phase. It was a beast, a Frankenstein monster of an airplane built around the largest engine available at the time, the Pratt & Whitney R2800. The engineers had bolted a massive 13-foot propeller to the front, which was so long that the wings had to be bent into an inverted gull shape just to keep the prop tips from chopping into the runway like a Packler lawnmower. From the outside, the Corsair looked predatory, like a shark with bent fins, a silhouette of pure aggression. But from the inside, it was a death trap for the unwary. The nose was so long that a pilot sitting in the cockpit could not see anything directly ahead of him while on the ground, creating a lethal blind spot. Taxiing a Corsair was like driving a semi-truck from the back seat while blindfolded, requiring the pilot to zigzag down the runway in a series of desperate S-turns just to see where the pavement ended. If you applied too much throttle on takeoff, the massive torque of the engine would flip the plane upside down and kill you instantly. If you landed too hard, the stiff landing gear would bounce the plane into the air like a rubber ball, stalling the wing and flipping the aircraft over into a fiery wreck. The Navy instructors called it the Ensign Eliminator, a grim nickname for a plane that seemed to hate its pilots. The men whispered in the barracks that the Corsair killed more Americans in training than the Japanese ever did in combat. But while the college boys feared the Corsair's temper, Walsh loved it with a passion born of understanding. He knew that the Corsair was not a delicate instrument of flight. It was a blunt instrument of industrial violence. It was heavy, fast, and unforgiving, much like the streets he grew up on. He treated the plane like a piece of industrial machinery, a tool designed for a single purpose, to destroy. While the other pilots tried to finesse the controls with a gentle touch, Walsh manhandled them, forcing the aircraft to obey his will. He knew that the Corsair did not want to turn in graceful circles. It wanted to run, to charge, to strike. It was a brick with a rocket attached, and if you kept the speed up, it was untouchable, a god of the sky. But if you slowed down, if you tried to play the enemy's game, it became a heavy, aluminum coffin. That morning had started as a total disaster, a series of mechanical failures that would have grounded any other man. Walsh had originally taken off in his personal aircraft, a plane he had maintained with obsessive care, but before he even cleared the runway perimeter, the engine began to choke on its own fuel. The manifold pressure dropped with a sickening suddenness, and the plane shuddered violently, the airframe groaning under the strain. A lesser pilot would have called it a day and waited for the mechanics. A mechanic like Walsh knew the plane was done, its heart failing. He spun the aircraft around in a tight, dangerous turn, taxied back to the flight line, and jumped out before the wheels had even stopped spinning. He ran across the hot coral airstrip, his boots kicking up dust, screaming at the ground crew to prep another plane, any plane. He found a spare, a battered, oil-streaked Corsair that had been ridden hard and put away wet. A loaner that no one wanted to fly because the trim was off and the hydraulics were notoriously leaky. Walsh didn't check the logbook for its history of failures. He didn't walk around to kick the tires or inspect the control surfaces. He climbed onto the wing, strapped himself into the seat, and slammed the canopy shut before the startled mechanics could tell him it was a bad idea. By the time he got the loaner airborne, his squadron was gone, a series of disappearing dots on the horizon. He was 20 minutes behind schedule, burning fuel at a suicidal rate of 100 gallons an hour just to catch up. As he climbed through 10,000 feet, the radio crackled with a chorus of bad news. The weather over the target area was closing in, a wall of tropical storms that threatened to swallow them whole. Thunderheads were building up like mountains of anvil-shaped cotton, hiding the Japanese airfields below in a shroud of gray. One by one, the other American fighters radioed that they were aborting the mission. They had lost visual contact, their engines were overheating in the thin air, they were turning back to the safety of the base. Walsh ignored the radio chatter, the voices of caution and fear. He kept the throttle pinned to the firewall, his hand steady even as the plane vibrated with the intensity of a dying star. The needle on his airspeed indicator crept past 300 miles per hour, then 350. The noise inside the cockpit was deafening, a constant, soul-crushing roar of wind and combustion that drowned out his own thoughts. He was sweating profusely, the tropical heat turning the cockpit into a humid sauna, soaking his flight suit until it clung to his skin like a second, heavier layer. The smell of high-octane aviation fuel and hot, scorched oil filled his oxygen mask, the distinct perfume of impending violence. He broke through a gap in the clouds, and that was when he saw them, the stakes of his gamble. The B-25 bombers he was supposed to protect were lumbering along at 8,000 feet, looking slow, fat, and incredibly vulnerable against the dark, dense jungle below. And diving toward them, dropping out of the sun like silver falcons, were the Zeros. The Japanese pilots had set a perfect trap, a masterclass in aerial ambush. They had waited with predatory patience until the American fighter escort turned back, knowing the bombers would be defenseless. They had not counted on the stubbornness of a single ex-mechanic from Brooklyn who refused to follow the rules. Walsh knew the math was impossible, a death sentence written in the sky. The Mitsubishi Zero was the most agile fighter plane on Earth, a masterpiece of lightweight design. It could turn on a dime and dance circles around the heavy, lumbering Corsair. In a turning dogfight, a Corsair pilot was dead in 30 seconds, his aircraft simply too heavy to keep up with the nimble Japanese fighter. The Japanese pilots were veterans, men who had been fighting and winning since the fires of Pearl Harbor. Men who knew exactly how to exploit every single one of the Corsair's many weaknesses. They would see a lone American fighter and laugh, seeing not a threat but fresh meat. They would expect him to run, to dive for the deck and flee for his life. Walsh checked his guns, his fingers moving with the precision of a man who knew every spring and firing pin. 6. 50 caliber Browning machine guns were mounted in the wings, 3 on each side, a battery of firepower that could tear through steel. He reached down and charged the weapons, hearing the heavy, satisfying clunk of the bolts sliding home, a sound of lethal intent. He had enough ammunition for about 30 seconds of sustained fire, and that was it. Once the triggers were depressed, he would be burning through ammo at a rate of 75 rounds per second, a torrential downpour of lead. He adjusted his gun sight, dialing up the brightness on the illuminated reticle until it glowed like a red eye. He looked at the formation of Zeros again. 50 against 1. The odds were not just bad, they were absurd. They were splitting up with practiced discipline, half of them diving on the bombers to begin the slaughter. The other half staying high to fly top cover and pick off any intruders. It was a perfect tactical setup, a net designed to catch and kill. And they had absolutely no idea he was there, a ghost in the machine. Walsh felt the old, familiar anger rising in his chest, the same cold, burning heat he felt when the officers looked down their noses at him in the mess hall. They said the Corsair was too heavy to fight. They said a mechanic couldn't lead a fighter squadron because he lacked the breeding. They said this mission was impossible and that he should have turned back like the others. Walsh rolled the Corsair to the right with a violent jerk of the stick and pushed the nose forward. The big blue fighter dropped its nose and began to dive, a falling anvil of vengeance. The airspeed indicator wound up past 350, then 380, then 400. The controls stiffened as the air rushed over the wings like solid water, making every movement a test of physical strength. The whine of the supercharger grew to a high-pitched shriek that pierced through his flight helmet. He was not just falling, he was accelerating into the fight with the kinetic energy of a runaway freight train. He was going to hit them so hard and so fast that they wouldn't have time to be better pilots, wouldn't have time to use their agility or their grace. He was going to turn the sky into a street brawl, and in a brawl, you don't need a slide rule or a degree in literature, you need a hammer. Kenneth Walsh was the hammer, and he was about to drop on the Japanese formation with the weight of 5 tons of aluminum and steel. Gravity was now the only thing that mattered, his greatest ally in a fight against a lighter foe. As Walsh dove from 10,000 feet, the physics of the engagement shifted violently in his favor, the heavy weight of the Corsair becoming its primary weapon. A fighter plane is usually defined by how well it dances in the horizontal plane, but Walsh was not trying to dance. He was turning his 12,000-pound Corsair into a kinetic missile, a projectile of pure momentum. The speedometer needle was buried past 400 miles per hour, entering the danger zone where the airframe begins to scream. At that speed, the air becomes thick and viscous, resisting the aircraft like invisible syrup. The control stick felt frozen in his hand, stiffened by the immense pressure of the wind rushing over the ailerons at near-sonic speeds. A rookie pilot would have fought the controls, terrified by the lack of responsiveness, but Walsh let it happen, embracing the rigidity. He knew that this stiffness was his armor, his shield against the enemy's agility. At 400 miles per hour, the lightweight Japanese Zeros could not touch him. If they tried to follow him at this speed, their wings would literally rip off their fuselages. They were built from plywood and lightweight duralumin, designed to float like butterflies in a gentle breeze. The Corsair was built from slab-sided aluminum and heavy steel, designed to fall like a safe drop from a penthouse window. He crashed into the Japanese formation with the subtlety of a freight train derailment, a blue blur of destruction. He did not pick a specific target at first. He simply aimed for the center of the mass and squeezed the trigger, letting the 6 Brownings speak. The machine guns in his wings erupted with a muzzle flash that rivaled the sun. The recoil was so powerful, it felt like the plane had hit a brick wall in midair, slowing his forward progress. Tracers streaked out ahead of him, bright red lines of fire connecting his aircraft to the enemy in a lethal web. The Japanese pilots never saw him coming, their situational awareness blinded by their focus on the bombers. They were looking at the slow, helpless targets below, already imagining their victory. Suddenly, a blue thunderbolt screamed through their formation, scattering them like bowling pins in a dark alley. Walsh pulled back on the stick with both hands, fighting the crushing G-forces that tried to push his stomach into his boots and drain the blood from his brain. The Corsair groaned under the load, its bent wings flexing until the rivets popped, but it held together, a testament to the mechanics who built it. He rocketed upward, trading his massive speed for altitude in a maneuver known as a zoom climb. This was the Mustang solution to fighting a Zero, a tactic born of necessity. The experts back in Washington had written manuals saying the Zero was invincible in a dogfight, their charts showing the Japanese plane's superior turn rate. They said you couldn't beat a plane that could turn inside you, but Walsh knew the experts were looking at the wrong numbers. Trapped in two-dimensional thinking, they were thinking about horizontal circles, the dance of the duelist. Walsh was thinking in vertical lines, the strike of the hawk. He knew that the Zero's lightweight construction, its greatest strength in a turn, was also its fatal flaw in the vertical. It had no momentum, no mass to carry it upward. It was like a paper kite. It could turn on a dime, but the moment it tried to climb steeply, it ran out of energy and stalled, hanging helpless in the air. The Corsair was a brick, and while it took a lot of engine power to get it moving, once it was moving, it wanted to stay moving. As he zoomed upward, climbing almost vertically toward the sun, he looked back over his shoulder. 3 Zeros had taken the bait, their pilots' egos bruised by the sudden attack. They had whipped their noses up, trying to follow him into the vertical climb. For a few seconds, they hung there, their propellers clawing at the thin air, closing the distance. But then, the cold laws of physics took over. Their light frames ran out of kinetic energy, the gravity of the Earth pulling them back. They stalled, falling backward like leaves in a breeze, their controls becoming mushy and useless. Walsh was still climbing, his massive double-wasp engine dragging him skyward, with the relentless strength of a titan. He watched the Zeros flop over, helpless and slow, their bellies exposed to the sky. This was the moment of vindication. The proof that the grease monkey had turned the college boy's math problem upside down and shaken the answers out of it. He wasn't dogfighting, he was energy fighting, a game of potential and kinetic power. He kicked the rudder over, hammering the Corsair into a violent stall turn at the top of his loop, the world spinning in a dizzying blur of blue and green. The nose dropped, pointing back down at the helpless Zeros who were still struggling to regain their flying speed. Now he was the predator, and they were the prey. He lined up on the trailing aircraft, the red dot of his sight resting on the enemy's cockpit. The Japanese pilot was struggling to regain speed, his aircraft hanging almost motionless in the sky, a sitting duck. It was a target practice shot, the kind of opportunity a pilot dreams of. Walsh closed the distance to 200 yards, the details of the Zero becoming crystal clear. He didn't spray bullets in a panicked burst, he poured them with calculated precision. The .50 caliber rounds slammed into the Zero's fragile fuselage with the force of hammers. There was no armor plate on a Zero, no self-sealing fuel tanks to protect the pilot or the engine. It was a flying gas can, optimized for weight at the expense of survival. The rounds walked through the cockpit and into the wing roots, where the fuel was stored. The enemy plane didn't just break, it disintegrated in a spectacular explosion. The fuel tanks ignited instantly, turning the aircraft into a blossoming flower of orange fire and thick black smoke. The left wing folded up and tore away, tumbling down toward the ocean like a piece of discarded trash. One down, 49 to go, and the sky was just beginning to burn, but the element of surprise was gone, spent in that first glorious strike. The swarm had been kicked, and now it was angry, a hornet's nest stirred by a stick. The other Zeros abandoned the bombers and turned their full, lethal attention to the lone blue maniac who had just incinerated their wingmen. Walsh saw the change instantly, the shift from a hunting party to a focused kill team. The chaotic cloud of enemy fighters organized itself into a deadly net of steel. They were coming for him from all sides, a 360-degree nightmare. Above, below, left, right, there was no safe direction to turn. The sky was suddenly filled with the yellow blinking lights of 20mm cannons firing at him, the shells whistling past his canopy with a terrifying crack. This was where the loner Corsair began to show its true battered colors, its mechanical flaws becoming life-threatening. A well-maintained aircraft responds instantly to the pilot's touch, but this aircraft hesitated, its soul weary from neglect. The throttle linkage was sticky, requiring a heavy hand to adjust. The engine temperature was creeping up faster than it should have, the needles moving toward the danger zone. Walsh could feel the vibration changing, a rough grinding sensation in the floorboards that told him the oil wasn't circulating perfectly through the massive radial engine. He ignored it, pushing the mechanical anxiety to the back of his mind. He didn't have a choice. Survival required total focus. He was trapped in a box of enemy aircraft, and the walls were closing in with every passing second. A pair of Zeros dove on him from the high right, their guns sparking with lethal intent. Walsh didn't turn away to flee. He turned directly into them, a counterintuitive move that screamed against every survival instinct. If someone throws a punch at you on the street, your instinct is to duck away, but in air combat, turning away just exposes your belly and gives the enemy a longer, easier shot. Walsh banked hard right, spoiling their aim and forcing a head-on pass. The tracer zipped harmlessly behind his tail, missing by inches. He flashed past them so close he could see the individual rivets on their engine cowlings and the white scarves of the Japanese pilots fluttering in. The slipstream. The closing speed was over 600 miles per hour, a blink-and-you-die encounter that tested the limits of human reaction time. He was fighting for his life now, the adrenaline pumping through his veins in a cold, steady stream. The boom and zoom tactic required altitude and separation to work, but he had lost both in the heat of the engagement. He was down in the mud, tangled in a low-speed turning fight, exactly where the manual said a Corsair should never be. The Corsair felt heavy and sluggish, a weight that threatened to pull him out of the sky. Every time he hauled back on the stick to bring the nose around, he could feel the Zeros gaining on him, their superior agility allowing them to cut the corners. They were cutting inside his turn radius, sliding into position behind his tail like wolves closing in on a wounded elk. He cranked his neck around, checking the 6 o'clock position, his muscles screaming with the effort. 2 Zeros were locked on him, sitting just outside gun range, waiting for him to bleed off a little more speed, waiting for the Corsair to become a sitting duck. He needed an exit, a way to reset the fight before they found their mark. But you can't just call a timeout in the middle of a massacre. He slammed the throttle forward to emergency power, a setting that was never meant to be used for more than a few minutes. The engine roared in protest, drinking fuel at a prodigious, suicidal rate. The manifold pressure gauge pegged at the top of the scale, vibrating with the strain. He was asking the engine to give him 110%, to run hotter and harder than the engineers in Connecticut ever intended. If a cylinder head cracked now, he was dead. If a connecting rod snapped, he was dead. He put his faith in American steel and the skill of Brooklyn mechanics, trusting the machine to hold together for just one more minute. He pushed the nose down again, diving toward the wave tops where the air was thick and heavy. The Zeros followed, their pilots smelling blood in the water. They knew they had him. They knew a Corsair couldn't turn with them, so they expected him to try and run for home. But Walsh did something they didn't expect, a move born of desperation and genius. He didn't just dive in a straight line, he rolled. He threw the Corsair into a violent, high-speed corkscrew, using the plane's high roll rate to confuse the enemy's aim and make himself an impossible target. The world became a spinning kaleidoscope of sea and sky, the G-forces pulling at his face until his skin felt like it was melting. He was Kenneth Walsh, the Mustang, the grease monkey, and he was still the master of this sky, refusing to die in a borrowed plane. The Zeros, unable to match his roll rate at high speed, began to overshoot, their noses pointing at empty air where he had been a second before. He had created a momentary opening, a sliver of opportunity in a wall of death. He kicked the rudder, leveled the wings, and prepared to dive back into the fire, knowing that as long as his engine kept screaming, he was still the most dangerous man in the Solomon Islands. Every second he stayed in the fight was a second the bombers were safe, a second the Japanese pilots were looking at him instead of their targets. He was one man against 50, but in the cockpit of the Corsair, with the smell of oil in his lungs and the roar of the engine in his ears, Kenneth Walsh felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The battle was far from over, but the myth of the invincible Zero was dying with every burst of his guns, replaced by the reality of a Brooklyn boy who knew how to make a machine do the impossible. He would return to the fight, again and again, until the sky was empty or his wings were gone, for a Mustang never quits, and a mechanic always finds a way to make it work. This was the legendary stand of Kenneth Walsh, a man who proved that in the cockpit of a fighter plane, it wasn't the school you went to that mattered, but the fire in your soul and the grease on your hands. As the sun beat down on the Pacific, the lone Corsair climbed once more, a blue silhouette of defiance against the overwhelming odds, ready to write the next chapter in the history of aerial warfare with lead and fire. Inscribed. The F-4U Corsair was never intended to be a ballerina of the skies. It was a brutal, heavy-hitting gladiator designed with a singular, violent purpose in mind. While the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 could dance in tight, graceful circles that would leave most Allied pilots staring at their own tails, the Corsair possessed a different, more predatory kind of athleticism. It might not have been able to turn on a dime, but it could roll with a ferocity that defied its massive weight, spinning like a high-speed drill bit through the tropical air. This incredible roll rate was the Corsair's primary defensive grace, a mechanical advantage that made it nearly impossible for the Japanese pilots to maintain a steady lead on Kenneth Walsh as he plummeted through the past. NB. Formation. Every time a Zero pilot thought they had him centered in their reflector sights, Walsh would flick the stick, and the inverted gull-wing fighter would snap onto a different axis, leaving tracers to lash out uselessly. cutting the empty space where he had been a mere heartbeat before. The logic of the engagement was dictated by raw physics. The Corsair was a massive engine with a seat and wings attached, and Walsh was using every ounce of that kinetic energy to dictate the terms of the fight. He leveled out just 50 feet above the undulating Pacific, the massive three-bladed propeller kicking up a violent wake of salt spray that trailed behind him like the wake of a speedboat. Moving at 380 miles per hour on the deck, he was operating in a regime where the Zero simply could not compete. The air at sea level is thick, heavy, and unforgiving, requiring immense horsepower to overcome the parasitic drag that builds up at high speeds. While the delicate, lightweight Japanese engines began to choke and fade in the dense atmosphere, struggling to push their fragile airframes through the soup-like air, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine in the Corsair simply chewed through the resistance. It was a battle of industrial philosophies as much as a dogfight, and at this altitude, American muscle was winning. Walsh watched the silver specks in his rearview mirror shrink with a grim sense of satisfaction. 100 yards grew to 200, then 500, until the threat of immediate pursuit began to dissolve into the hazy horizon. He had survived the initial, terrifying pass, and he had drawn the first blood of the day. Yet as he pulled the heavy stick back to begin his climb, a cold realization settled in his chest. This wasn't just a tactical struggle, it was a battle against the inexorable laws of attrition. He was fighting the Japanese, yes, but he was also fighting a ticking clock. His fuel needles were sagging toward the left, his ammunition counters were bleeding numbers with every burst, and the enemy was no longer a disorganized swarm. They were adapting, evolving their tactics in real time to counter the lone wolf in their midst. The Japanese pilots were no longer merely chasing him in a futile pursuit. They were orchestrating a perimeter, a lethal kill box designed to catch him the moment he attempted to strike at the bombers again. High above, a quartet of Zeros was already positioning themselves, gaining the altitude advantage they would need to pounce the second he committed to another run. They were using his own sense of duty as a noose, knowing with absolute certainty that he would not abandon the B-25S. A more pragmatic man, a man focused solely on self-preservation, would have taken the exit ramp that he had just earned with his own sweat and blood. He had broken contact, he had a clear path to the safety of his home base, and no commander in the world would have blamed him for retreating after facing 50 enemy aircraft single-handedly. He had already achieved the status of a hero, by any standard metric. But Kenneth Walsh wasn't flying for the sake of a ribbon or a citation. He was flying for the kids in the glass noses of those bombers. Young men who lacked the protection of 650 caliber machine guns and a ton of armor plating. To leave them now would be to sign their death warrants, and that was a price Walsh refused to pay. He scanned his gauges with a practiced, mechanical eye. The oil temperature was climbing into the warning zone, but remained stable for now, while the hydraulic pressure was beginning to fluctuate with an ominous rhythm. The plane was reaching its limits, and so was he. With a sharp exhale, he pulled the stick back, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat as the Corsair's nose rose once more toward the hornet's nest. He wasn't going home. He was going back into the furnace. He chose a path directly into the blinding glare of the tropical sun, using the celestial fire to mask his approach, hoping to catch the enemy off guard one more time, but the element of surprise was a spent currency. The sky was no longer a place for tactical elegance. It had devolved into a street fight at 10,000 feet, a brutal brawl, where the only question left was how much punishment the Corsair could endure before it finally disintegrated. As he reached the apex of his climb, a sudden, sickening crack echoed through the cockpit. The canopy glass fractured into a spiderweb of crystalline shards, instantly blurring the world into a distorted mess. Whether it was a lucky long-range round or the sheer physical stress of the maneuvers, Walsh didn't know, but he was now fighting partially blind, peering through the jagged remnants of his vision, like a man looking through a shattered window into a nightmare. The sky became a kaleidoscope of terrifying imagery, and then came the thudding vibration of lead hitting metal, not his own guns. but the impact of enemy fire. The hunter was now the prey, and the Corsair was beginning to bleed. The battle had become a knife fight in a phone booth, a chaotic, swirling vortex of violence, where the traditional rules of engagement were discarded in favor of raw survival instinct. At 5,000 feet, the tactical maps and chalkboard strategies were meaningless. There were no clean formations left, only 50 aircraft occupying the same lethal patch of airspace in a frantic dance of death. Walsh was a solitary blue speck in a predatory sea of gray. The Japanese pilots, sensing his vulnerability, circled like sharks around a wounded whale, their 7.7mm rounds punching jagged holes through the Corsair's duralumin skin. Walsh was operating on pure muscle memory now, the lessons of the flight manual long since overridden by the demands of the moment. The manual said to avoid turning engagements, but the manual assumed you had a wingman to clear your six. Walsh was alone. Every time he tried to line up a shot, he was forced to break away as another Zero dove on his tail. A relentless game of Russian roulette played at 300 miles per hour. His flight suit was a sodden weight of sweat and adrenaline, his eyes burning from the acrid fumes of cordite and the salt of his own exertion. Then, he saw his opening a lone Zero, fixated on a B-25 below, losing its situational awareness in its hunger for a kill. It was a fatal lapse. Walsh slammed the stick over, the Corsair groaning under the immense strain as he cut inside the Zero's flight path. He didn't try to outturn the lighter plane. He used the vertical, trading his hard-earned speed for altitude in a high-speed yo-yo maneuver that dropped him squarely behind the enemy. The Zero filled his windscreen, a perfect target. He squeezed the trigger, and for a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. A cold spike of panic hit him, a gun jam at the worst possible moment. In the humid tropical heat of the Pacific, the ammunition belts could swell, or the feed chutes could become choked with residue. He was flying a $60,000 paperweight, pointing 6 silent guns at a target that was about to escape. In a fit of mechanical desperation, he hammered his fist against the gun charger handles, the heavy bolts slamming back and forth with a metallic clang that vibrated through the airframe. He squeezed again, and this time, the guns roared to life, though unevenly. Only 3 of his 6 guns were firing, creating an asymmetric recoil that threatened to yaw the plane out of control. It didn't matter. At this range, he didn't need a scalpel, he needed a sledgehammer. The 50 caliber rounds tore into the Zero's wing root, and the effect was instantaneous. The Japanese fighter didn't just burn, it vanished in a catastrophic fireball as its fuel tanks vaporized. Walsh flew directly through the debris, the terrifying sound of metal fragments peppering his wings and propeller like hail on a tin roof. Soot and oil splattered across his already broken windscreen, blinding him for a moment of pure terror. Kill number 2 was confirmed, but there was no time for celebration. As he emerged from the smoke, a primal warning flared in his mind. He didn't need to look to know he was being targeted. He kicked the rudder, skidding the Corsair sideways, just as a stream of 20mm cannon shells whistled through the space he had occupied a second before. These weren't the small machine gun bullets he could ignore. These were explosive rounds that could turn a man into red mist or an engine into scrap. Metal. The Japanese pilot on his tail was an expert, correcting his aim with lethal precision. The next burst found its mark with the force of a sledgehammer, blowing a hole the size of a dinner plate in Walsh's right wing and severing the hydraulic lines. Fluid sprayed into the slipstream, atomizing into a fine mist as the controls went dead in his hand. The Corsair wanted to roll over and surrender to gravity, but Walsh refused to let it go. He jammed his knee against the stick, using every ounce of his physical strength to keep the wings level, even as the engine temperature needles buried themselves past the red line. The double Wasp was melting, its pistons scraping against the cylinder walls in a desperate, final struggle to keep turning. Most men would have bailed out, choosing the uncertainty of the jungle over the certainty of a burning coffin. But Walsh looked down at the bombers and stayed. He spotted the leader of the pack, a Zero marked with a distinctive red stripe pulling up from a strafing run. It was a high deflection shot, a gamble that required him to fire into the empty air where he predicted the enemy would be in 2 seconds. It was the ultimate test of an aviator's intuition. Ignoring the violent vibrations that threatened to shake the instrument panel apart, Walsh squeezed the trigger one last time. The tracers arched through the sky, a desperate curve of light that seemed destined to miss until the Zero flew directly into the stream. The rounds stitched a line of fire from the tail to the cockpit, and the enemy leader slumped forward as his plane entered a terminal flat spin. Kill number 3. Suddenly, the sky felt unnervingly empty. The remaining Zeros, their fuel and pride exhausted, turned back toward their base, leaving the lone, battered Corsair to face its final trial. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced by the freezing reality of a dead engine. The roar of 2,000 horsepower vanished, replaced by the haunting whistle of the wind. The propeller slowed, then stopped, one blade standing upright like a tombstone. Walsh was no longer a fighter pilot. He was the pilot of a 12,000-pound glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Hitting 7Ds, he was miles from any friendly base over the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Vella La Vella with an altimeter that was rapidly unwinding. His only hope was a half-finished coral airstrip being carved out of the jungle by the Navy Seabees. It was a short, jagged scar on the landscape, never intended for a landing like this. He had one chance, one perfectly managed glide to thread the needle. If he was too high, he'd overshoot into the sea. Too low, and he'd be swallowed by the trees. He pushed the nose down to maintain the critical airspeed needed to prevent a stall, the jungle canopy rushing up to meet him with terrifying speed. He could see the men on the ground, tiny figures waving their arms in warning or encouragement. He couldn't tell. He pulled the emergency gear handle, feeling the wheels thump into place with the last of his compressed air. The drag increased, the plane sank faster, and the coral strip loomed ahead, looking impossibly small. He wasn't praying, he was calculating, a mechanic trying to coax one last favor from a dying machine. At the last possible second, he flared the aircraft, the Corsair floating for a heartbeat before slamming into the coral with a bone-jarring impact. This wasn't a landing, it was a controlled crash. Without brakes or flaps, the plane was a runaway train, shredding its tires and leaping back into the air before crashing down again in a cloud of white dust. The jungle wall was approaching fast, a green wall of death. In a final, desperate act, Walsh ground-looped the plane, jamming the rudder and locking the remaining brake. The Corsair spun violently, its wingtip digging into the coral and acting as an anchor, spinning the heavy fighter 180 degrees before it finally came to a rest, just yards from the tree line. Silence returned to the island, broken only by the settling of dust and the ticking of cooling metal. Inside the cockpit, Kenneth Walsh sat motionless, his hands still fused to the controls, his lungs burning with the scent of high-octane fuel and scorched earth. He had done the impossible. He had held the line when everything suggested he should run, and he had brought his broken bird home against every law of probability. As he unbuckled his harness and slid down the side of the fuselage, his legs gave way, leaving him to sit in the dirt against the tire of the plane that had saved his life. When the Seabees reached him, expecting to find a corpse, they found instead a man who had stared into the abyss and refused to blink, a pilot whose resolve was as unbreakable as the steel of his Corsair. The mission was over, the bombers were safe, and Kenneth Walsh had carved his name into the annals of aerial warfare through sheer, unadulterated will. The Corsair stood behind him, a mangled wreck of aluminum and heroism, a testament to the fact that sometimes the man in the cockpit is the most powerful component of the machine. The silence of the jungle was now his only companion, a stark contrast to the screaming chaos he had just escaped. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the weight of what he had achieved finally began to settle in. He wasn't just a survivor, he was the living embodiment of the grit and technical mastery that would eventually turn the tide of the entire war. Every hole in the fuselage, every bent piece of metal, told a story of a moment where he could have given up but chose to fight on. It was a victory measured not just in downed enemies, but in the lives of the men he had protected Men who would go home because one Marine pilot refused to let the odds dictate his destiny. The Corsair, in all its battered glory, remained a silent witness to a feat of arms that would be whispered about in ready rooms for decades to come. A reminder that in the high-stakes arena of combat, the difference between a tragedy and a legend often comes down to a single pilot's refusal to quit when the world is falling apart around him. Walsh took a long, shaky breath, the air of Vella La Vella tasting sweeter than anything he had ever known. Knowing that while the plane might never fly again, he had fulfilled the highest calling of his craft. He had stayed, he had fought, he had won. And in the quiet aftermath of the storm, that was all that truly mattered. The Seabees stood in a circle around the wreck, their voices hushed in reverence as they looked at the jagged holes and the missing chunks of the tail, realizing they were standing in the presence of something far greater than a mere mechanical failure. They were looking at the physical manifestation of a miracle, forged in the heat of battle and delivered to their doorstep by a man who simply wouldn't die. The war would continue, more missions would be flown, and more planes would be lost, but for this one day, on this one unfinished strip of coral, the darkness had been held at bay by a single, resolute soul in a bent-wing bird. As Walsh was helped into the back of a waiting jeep, he looked back one last time at the silhouette of his fighter against the darkening sky. A broken gladiator resting at the edge of the world, and he knew that as long as there were men like him in the sky, the horizon would always belong to those with the courage to claim it. The legacy of that afternoon would ripple through the fleet, a story of defiance that would bolster the spirits of every pilot who climbed into a cockpit. A reminder that even when the guns jam and the engine dies, the spirit of the aviator remains the ultimate weapon. Walsh closed his eyes as the jeep pulled away, the exhaustion finally claiming him. But the fire that had carried him through the gauntlet would never truly go out. It would live on in the stories, in the history books, and in the silent, respectful nods of the men who knew exactly what it took to fly a Corsair into the heart of the sun and come back to tell the tale. This was the essence of the Pacific War, a grueling, relentless test of man and machine, and on this day, both had proven to be forged of the strongest stuff imaginable. The coral dust settled, the jungle reclaimed its quiet, and the legend of Kenneth Walsh was etched forever into the salt and sand of the Solomon Islands. A beacon of what is possible when the heart of a warrior meets the wings of a legend. In the vast, uncaring expanse of the ocean, one man had made a difference, and that difference was the margin between life and death for dozens of his comrades. As the stars began to poke through the tropical twilight, the silent Corsair on the edge of the runway stood as a monument to a courage that transcends the mechanical, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome the impossible. The fight was over, but the echo of those 50 caliber guns would resonate through time. A thunderous reminder of the day a lone pilot took on an empire and refused to fall. Walsh's name would be added to the list of the greats, but to him, he was just a man who had a job to do and did it until the very end. The journey from the cockpit to the coral had been a short distance in miles, but a lifetime in experience, transforming a pilot into a legend and a plane into a relic of a struggle that defined a generation. The Pacific was a theater of vast distances and lonely deaths, but on this small island, a story of survival had been written in fire and steel, a story that would never be forgotten as long as men fly into the unknown. The Seabees would eventually finish the runway, the war would move on to other islands and other skies, but the spirit of that landing would remain, a ghost of a moment where the impossible became reality. Walsh would fly again, in other planes and other battles, but he would always carry a piece of this day with him, a reminder of the thin line between the hero and the fallen. The Corsair, the Whistling Death, had earned its name 1,000 times over, but on this day, it was the Whistling Life, a vessel that carried a man through the fire and delivered him back to the earth. It was a story of physics, of engineering, and of luck, but above all, it was a story of heart. And in the end, that was the only thing that could ever truly conquer the sky. The finality of the engine's silence had been the loudest sound Walsh had ever heard, a vacuum that demanded to be filled with action, and he had filled it with the only thing he had left, his own indomitable will. As the jeep disappeared into the shadows of the palms, the island of Vella La Vella held its breath, a silent witness to the greatness that had just touched its shores. The war was far from over, but for Kenneth Walsh, the greatest battle had already been won, not in the destruction of his enemies, but in the salvation of his soul and the protection of his brothers. The broken glass, the smoking engine, and the shredded wings were just the price of admission to a club where few are invited and even fewer return. He was one of the lucky ones, one of the few who had seen the face of death and lived to tell the story, and as he drifted into a well-earned sleep, the world outside continued its slow, violent rotation, forever changed by the events of a single, extraordinary hour in the skies above the Pacific. The Corsair was no longer a functioning airplane. It was a flying sieve, a collection of jagged holes held together by little more than prayer and the sheer, unyielding stubbornness of its pilot. The ground crew stopped counting the bullet holes after they passed 50, but the visible damage was merely the surface of the catastrophe. Deep within the airframe, the right-wing spar, the very spine of the aircraft's structural integrity was cracked and groaning under the stress of flight. The horizontal stabilizer had been shredded into a metallic lace that fluttered uselessly in the turbulent slipstream. Even the heavy armor plate bolted behind Walsh's seat, the final barrier between life and death, was dented and scarred from direct hits that should have been fatal. The engine cowling was a blackened, slick mess, completely soaked in hot oil that threatened to ignite into a terminal fireball with every single spark from the cylinders. One of the Seabees looked at Kenneth Walsh, then back at the smoking, twisted wreck of the plane, and simply shook his head in a state of profound, silent shock. He asked how the hell Walsh had managed to keep that mechanical corpse in the air,
just pointed the nose where it needed
expecting
to go.
perhaps some heroic or poetic monologue about the spirit of flight. But Walsh didn't have a poetic answer. He was a man of action, not words. He simply stated that he pointed the nose where it needed to go and refused to let go. This utter lack of ego was exactly what the high-ranking officers and the elite pilots couldn't fathom. The ride back to his own base had been a hauntingly quiet affair. The usual roar of the engine replaced by the eerie whistling of the wind through the punctured fuselage. When he finally arrived, the atmosphere on the base had shifted from mockery to a heavy, suffocating silence. The skepticism that had followed him like a shadow since he joined the squadron was gone, replaced by a chilling realization. The college boy officers, those privileged sons who had mocked the grease monkey and whispered that a former mechanic lacked the refined finesse to master a high-performance fighter, now looked at him with a mixture of shame and utter disbelief. They had turned back when the weather grew thick and the clouds turned black. They had turned back when their engines coughed or ran a little rough, fearing a mechanical failure. But Walsh? Walsh had deliberately flown a broken, dying aircraft into a literal swarm of 50 Japanese Zeros. He hadn't just survived the encounter, he had aggressively engaged them, shot down 3 of the enemy's best, and walked away without a scratch on his body. He had proven, with brutal and bloody finality, that the slide rule and the academic textbook were useless without the raw heart and technical soul to back them up. He had taken their insults and buried them deep under the burning wreckage of 3 Japanese fighters. Why did he succeed where the experts would have failed? Because he understood the machine better than they understood their own souls.
Like a specter.
He didn't just fly the Corsair, he felt its heartbeat. The paperwork for the mission crawled up the chain of command, met with intense incredulity at every level. The descriptions of the battle were so frantic, so seemingly impossible, that senior officers demanded verification from every possible source before they would sign off on the reports. They checked the radar logs, searching for errors in the data. They interviewed the terrified bomber crews who had been the primary target of the Japanese raid. Every witness told the same terrifying, awe-inspiring story. A lone blue fighter, diving like a vengeful ghost into the very center of a massive enemy formation. The story checked out in every detail. A single Corsair, flown by a single Marine who had once spent his days covered in engine grease, had disrupted an entire Japanese air raid. He hadn't just saved the bombers, he had shattered the enemy's formation and forced a superior force into a chaotic retreat. On the 8th of February, 1944, Kenneth Walsh stood at attention in a ceremony that felt a world away from the suffocating heat, blood, and oil of the Solomon Islands. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's words echoed through the hall as Walsh was presented with the Medal of Honor, the highest award for valor the United States could bestow. The citation was filled with formal language like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, but stripped of the fancy adjectives, it told a simple human story. A man who wasn't supposed to be there had done what no one else would dare to do. He had flown into the teeth of the enemy alone, not because of a direct order, but because he refused to let his friends die while he still had a drop of fuel and a single belt of ammunition. But the medal didn't change the man. Walsh didn't retire to a safe desk job to polish his trophy and wait out the war. He went right back to the cockpit. He kept flying, proving that his technical knowledge was his greatest tactical advantage. By the time the war ended, Kenneth Walsh had shot down 21 Japanese aircraft, becoming the first Corsair ace in history. He had taken an aircraft that everyone initially called a death trap, the Ensign Eliminator, and transformed it into the deadliest weapon in the Deadlies, Pacific Theater. He taught the other pilots his hard-won secrets, showing them how to ignore the theoretical turn charts and instead trust the visceral, mechanical scream of the engine. He taught them that the Corsair wasn't a delicate ballerina, it was a heavy, unforgiving hammer, and if you swung it with enough conviction and speed, nothing in the sky could stand in your way. He survived the war, a feat that defied every statistical probability of that violent era. He stayed in the Marine Corps, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel, living a life of quiet, humble dignity. He didn't brag or hold court in bars. He remained a professional to the very end. But those who truly know aviation, those who study the cold, hard history of air combat, know his name. They know that the legend of the Corsair, the plane that broke the back of the Japanese Air Force, was written by a mechanic from Brooklyn who knew how to make metal sing under pressure. History often forgets the technicians, the men with grease under their fingernails, who actually understand how the world works. We remember the generals with stars and the politicians with speeches, but we forget the men who knew how to tighten a bolt, listen to a valve, and fly a machine past its breaking point. Kenneth Walsh represents that forgotten breed. He was the ultimate vindication of the working man. He proved that a degree from an elite university doesn't make you a warrior. Courage and an intimate, mechanical understanding of your machine make you a fighter pilot. Today, the Corsair looks like a piece of art with its iconic bent wings. But if you look closer, you can see the violence in its design. It is a machine built to dominate, and Kenneth Walsh was its perfect human equivalent, rough, powerful, and utterly unstoppable. We rescue these stories to remember the jagged, painful reality of the men who fought. We tell Walsh's story to ensure he doesn't disappear into the silence of time. We tell it to remember that sometimes the experts are wrong. Sometimes the smart thing to do is turn back. But the necessary thing, the thing that saves lives and wins wars, is to push the throttle to the firewall, ignore the impossible odds, and dive headlong into the fire. Kenneth Walsh died in 1998, but in the eternal records of history, he is still there, 4,000 feet above the Pacific, alone against 50, deciding that today is the day he shows the world exactly what a grease monkey can do.